I would love to start by just, I'll make a statement, and then I'd love to have those of you who are experts, or maybe if it's just a small group here, you can all answer this question. Um, to say, did I get that statement right, or is there something I didn't get right about that? So the statement that I would start off by saying is that um, that gender affirmative care, um, uh, as long as it doesn't rush into medical interventions, is the best way to treat kids who are trans, but may not be the best way to treat everyone who presents that way. How's that for a statement? So let's start with Corinna, because you seem to have a thought right away.
Yeah, I apologize. I don't play poker because if I have even just like a single ace in my hand, I start getting excited, like, oh yeah, go all the way in. So gender affirming care, provided that it's done carefully, is the best way to treat trans kids. I think I encapsulated that more or less correct. I want to first come to terms about what a trans kid is, because I think that that's something that we really need to unpack a little bit. You see a lot of signs that the protesters are holding that say protect trans kids. But a point that I want to make is that whether you conceive of a child as being a trans kid, or whether you conceive of them being a child who is experiencing gender dysphoria, is going to create a very strong bias in how you choose to provide an intervention for the mental health of that child. And my concern about the term trans kid or transgender child is that once a child is labeled with that term, it seems to be indelible, right, despite the fact that we know that for prepubescent children, that if they say that they have gender dysphoria, or that they identify as the opposite sex, that if they are supported to find comfort in their natal sex, that the vast majority of them will desist from having a trans identification over time. But if you take that same child and you say that they're a trans kid, now the mentality that you have in treating them is to help them achieve their authentic self, which is certainly going to be a path towards gender transition. So name change, referring to them as different pronouns, and supporting that in a social setting, and almost certainly, inevitably, medicalization. So I just want to start by saying we should be suspicious of making an assumption that there is even such thing as a trans kid, because we cannot identify that there's any innate quality of transness in any individual, and that includes anybody who transitions. And Beck, I see you nodding your head, so I think you know where I'm coming from. Is I can't show you in me which part is trans. It's just a set of decisions that I made over time. And it's the same with children, is that you can't point to any part of the child and say, this is why this is a trans child. But what you can say is that this child is experiencing a form of gender dysphoria. So I know that doesn't even get to the heart of your question, Pamela, but I'm sorry, I'm coming out of the gate by attacking the premise.
It does. And Buck, I want you to weigh in. It does actually get to the heart of the question, like right away, because that really is like, the question is, how do we tell who is, truly a trans kid and who is a kid with gender dysphoria who will desist? And so that, since we don't have, so I was sort of starting in a different place to say, like, if we could tell, let's say we could tell, then would that statement make sense that I made? If we could tell, if there was some all of a sudden there's a test and it's 100% accurate. You can tell which kids are truly trans and which kids have gender dysphoria and will desist. So in those cases, then using this gender affirmative model, like you said, Corinna, the mentalities to help them achieve their authentic gender, right? So then that would be the approach to take if we knew for sure that that was a thing, right? That they were, and Lisa, you want to say something?
Well, I want to point out that today there's this new study out about very young socially transitioned children. So, I mean, Corinna talked about unpacking trans kids. There's also unpacking what gender affirming care means. And the
Yes.
study out today shows that if you socially transition very young children, especially children before they understand the concept of gender constancy, right? In the beginning, children don't know the difference between sex and sex stereotypes. It takes many years to figure out that this is my body and it's unchangeable. I mean, of course, we're not telling kids that anymore, but and that if I put on a dress, it won't make me a girl. It takes many years. They go through many stages to figure out the difference between the cultural associations we have with boys and girls and the physical reality of being a boy or a girl. So what the study out today shows is that if you socially transition them very young, I can't remember the number, but it was in the 90s, I think, of persistence, and then in the 60s of going on to medical care. And what's kind of fascinating about that is that in the previous studies, when we didn't socially transition children, the the figures were similar in that something like 88 in the last study, 88% of them desisted and 64% of them were gay.
Wait. You
Same
said
sex attracted. Later on, were same sex attracted, and a small percentage went on to medicalize in these earlier studies.
so. Look, say this again. Let's do that. You said if we socially, this study that came out today said that if socially transitioning children very young resulted in a 90+% persistence,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then 60% of that 90% that persisted go
Went
on.
on to medicalize, but it's a 5-year study, so some of them may still be too young to medicalize, but a
And
high
so,
rate of medicalization.
but let me just ask one more question. The medicalization, because they're so young, the medicalization would at this point just be puberty blockers, right? It wouldn't be
Oh no,
cross-sex.
I'm saying the kids were socially transitioned young.
Right.
5 years later, those 60% of them were medicalizing. They're old enough to medicalize now, right? They were
Medicalizing meaning puberty blockers or also cross-sex hormones?
I haven't looked that extensively. Could be, all kinds of things. So what I'm suggesting, therefore, is in this situation, you know, some people will interpret that as trans kids know themselves.
Right.
Other people will interpret that as an iatrogenic process of the gender affirming care created the trans children.
Right.
This and in the New York Times, unsurprising story about it today, when they bring up the desistance literature, the 10, 11 studies that were pretty consistent, they only bring them up to say, this is what always happens, they only bring them up to say they're not relevant. The reporter got someone to say, we shouldn't look at that past literature. It was a different time, there was less acceptance. But there's enough of that literature to show an overlap between gender dysphoria and homosexuality, and that children can become comfortable with their bodies, and then a small percentage weren't. They never were, and they went on, and medical transition was the best option for them. But I think they also weren't. I don't think it's just gender affirming care, because we can't separate it from this ideology that's now leaked into the water of our society generally, that kids are being taught that biological sex is not real or unimportant, right? And that everyone has a gender identity and that's what matters, and sometimes we have to fix our bodies to match our gender identities. All of this it's not just the New York Times is categorizing that as increasing social acceptance, but another way of putting that is that we have this kind of religious ideology that we're imposing onto young children. So I'm just not, I think even even the first part of the sentence about gender affirming care, we have to unpack that too. And I think this study is going to be taken, for me it's proof that, because of my biases, the study is proof that gender affirming care like sort of creates trans children. For other people it's proof that kids know themselves for a young age and we have to listen to them.
And it seems like it probably is both, right? If there are kids who are in that category of will never desist and will get tremendous relief from transitioning, and then will go on to be very happy in the other, sex role, the other gender, um, then they're going to be captured, right? In that group, they'll be captured in that group. So for some proportion of that group, it's positive. But it seems to me that it must be a much larger proportion for which it is an iatrogenic issue. Buck, what are your thoughts?
Hi, thanks. I'm of course I'm coming to this as not a professional and more of a person who lives this actual life. So really what Karina started with is so right on. I can't even like touch that. It was like so perfect, my friend. So so I think in a nutshell, that kids are kids. And this has really always been my platform out there, really talking about trans kids. I think we're literally making such a huge mistake by labeling them right out the gate. And there's so many layers here. I don't even think I could just be so direct because, now I transitioned such a long time ago when I didn't have this influence. And I do think there's some form of influence going on. And so, yeah, maybe it's more what you were saying, Lisa, maybe it's more accepted now, but that's because it's being put out there in a way that people can see it more and children can see it more and people are seeing it more. I don't necessarily think it's accepted. I think it's being on some level pushed upon people to make this not even a choice, just to say you have to believe this is true. So I don't believe in affirmative care. And I don't care all of the things you just said to me, Pamela, in a perfect world. Well, first off, that's not real.
Right.
Secondly, I just think that um, affirmative care is not therapy. It is on some level indoctrination because you are not, therapy is pushing back. That's what I would not be here. I actually give my life to my therapist because if it wasn't for my therapist, I wouldn't be here. And therapy, as probably you all know, is the number one most important thing. If you have any kind of dysphoria or whatever, that's where you need to go. But a therapist shouldn't be saying, "Oh yeah, you're trans. You said you are." That's ridiculous. That is not therapy. You have to give this child an opportunity to sort of feel around what that even means and what it means. That way I feel like a boy. What does that even mean? I feel like a girl. I don't think kids even understand at that age what that means. And so for me, it's more about we got to let these kids go through a normal space. And even if you want to call it suffering, I don't care. Call it whatever you want. But these kids need to be kids and deal with whatever these things. Yeah, there's some trans kids in there, 100%. I probably was a trans kid, but I don't like these labels. I don't like that we're literally calling these kids trans kids when they, as we all know here, could be gay. They could actually be gay, or they could be straight, or they could just be dealing with whatever they're dealing with. So really, where I'm coming from is that I think we're pushing. I think we're pushing in a direction as opposed to letting kids just sort of feel like what's going on around here and saying, "Hey, kiddo, yeah, cool, you feel this way." And then the next day, they're probably going and feeling something else. I mean, we all know that kids are constantly going back and forth. So I am just not of the space of trans kids and of the space of affirmative care because you're not giving this child enough time to figure themselves out. And like we all know, kids don't know even their sexuality on some level at that age, or even their bodies. When I was growing into my body, it was horrifying. I hated it. And I think everyone here can say that. That's not a trans kid thing. That's not a even a dysphoric thing. That's like a normal thing. And I think we're on some level getting mixed up about what is normal and what is not normal. Or you know what I mean? Like, do we even know what is normal for a child when they're going through whatever their puberty or growing into that stuff. So
I'm going
that's
to
kind of
ask
where I'm coming
Joe as a therapist to talk about this, but also it makes me think that this is maybe this sort of phenomenon, maybe a bit of a microcosm of a bigger phenomenon that we're seeing, where we've sort of managed to create an entire generation or more of young people who think that if they're not happy, there's something wrong.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
and that they don't have the sense, they haven't, like when I was a kid, I'm old enough that when I was a kid there was just no expectation that you were supposed to be happy all the time.
That's right. That's right. And my parents did so I think it was you, Lisa, that talked about social transitioning.
Yeah.
I'm huge on that's what I did in the 60s. I'm 59. I was a little social, kid in the 60s. My parents let me be Buck. It was the most amazing, healthy thing they could have ever done. I got teased. I got all of the things that now these kids are like so sensitive about. All of that stuff. It made me who I am.
but
So I do think social transitioning is really awesome.
but when you were a kid and you socially transitioned to being Buck,
Yeah.
did your peers use male pronouns for you?
That's a great question. Most of the time, yes, because I think they just thought of me as a little boy. You know what I mean? Because I was a little boy, but I definitely got teased. Like maybe starting sixth, seventh grade. I think that's when bodies start changing, and girls and boys start kind of separating at school. You know what I mean? In those places, and I wanted to go with the boy group. But they were like, "You're a girl, you're a girl." But I had to become tough and be like, "I'm a boy." So there most definitely was all of those things, but I don't think those are bad for kids on some level, unless you're getting beat up like that. But I just think those things are where kids find themselves.
So it sounds like, and I'm going to let Joe address this, and then Stella, but it sounds like because there wasn't a culture around you of having everybody reflect, or not even reflect, having everybody unreflectively kind of accept gender stereotypes and say, if you're not the stereotype, you must be something else, then you were in this very small minority of people who were able to distinguish the difference between being a tomboy and
That's right.
right. And but now, as Lisa has found, and I've spoken to people with kids now, and people I knew who were very very masculine tomboys um, in my cohort as children, who developed into heterosexual women. So, Joe, what are you seeing, and what you've heard so far? What are your thoughts?
Well, totally in agreement with what Buck has been saying. I think that to answer your question, I think affirmative care and exploratory therapy are antithetical. They're,
Okay.
you can't do exploratory therapy if you have affirmed a child's trans identity. You can't do that because it then becomes focused on gender as an issue rather than if you can steer clear of affirming, you leave room for all the other issues that are loaded into gender to come forward. I mean, that's the challenge if you're working with someone who's gender questioning, is to not get trapped into a discussion where everything focuses on gender. And then you see it more clearly in people who have desisted, where all the things that they thought was going to be solved by transitioning, it's still there, right? Once they've accepted it didn't work, then all this stuff comes forward, and you can work with it. The challenge is with somebody who hasn't transitioned and who believes in a trans identity, to get them to open up and explore other possibilities rather than everything is explained by having the wrong gender in their body or having the wrong body to align with their gender.
So just like anything, an explanatory principle ends up not, explaining anything if it can explain everything, right?
Right.
So, and Stella, what are you seeing? And what are your thoughts about this? Don't forget to unmute there, Stella. There
Sorry,
you
yeah, I agree with everybody. I think I think compassionate exploratory therapy helps people. And I think if you have gender distress, you'll be helped because you'll be helped to, emotionally regulate, to manage your distress. And also it will give you the benefit of having kind of explored your psyche and explored your awareness and your bias towards certain roles, so that if you do transition, you'll be on much stronger ground. You'll be in a much safer place. Well, if you've just been nodded along to, maybe, you might have dark nights of the soul later on in your transition when it's very difficult or you have medical complications and you're looking back, you won't be able to think, I explored all my options. You won't have that strong basis. So to me, exploratory therapy would be a much more appropriate response, even if there was such a thing as trans kids. And I very much fall in with Corinna about that concept. Is to me just, well, some people gender dysphoria sticks and some people it doesn't. But even so, I would say you would benefit a good deal more from conventional therapy than from something that just nods along and doesn't give you any opportunity to explore yourself.
So there are some uh, diagnoses that can't be made until certain ages, right? Um, and it's been a long time since I was a clinician, so I don't remember all of them. But for example, I think borderline personality disorder can't be diagnosed until the teenage years, right? Though, or at least it used to be that way. Of course, I did my training with the DSM-3R, so that was a while back. Um, but um, but would you say that it would make sense to stop labeling children as trans and say that trans is a label for adulthood, and that until that point, um, it should be maybe gender exploring or gender curious or
Non-conforming.
gender non-conforming, yeah, right, and to
Yeah, I think so.
label off the
I
table
think
at a certain age.
Well, I want to know why we need to call them
I
trans
think
kids.
that would
Why do we have to call them trans? Why are we calling them trans kids?
be
Stella, we lost you a little bit. You're breaking up. I think. I think.
very helpful for everybody.
Uh,
Sorry, am I? I just wanted to say, if you look at can you hear me? No,
now we can hear, but you're maybe turn your
no.
camera off, and that
Okay.
gives some. Then we might hear
If
you better.
you What I'm trying to say desperately is, if you look at the DSM and if you look at the criteria for the children's diagnosis of gender dysphoria, 5 out of 8 of those criteria are based on very stereotypical bases, such as they like the opposite gender's games, they like the opposite gender's toys, they like the opposite gender's um, uh, playmates. It's silly and it's stereotypical and it's old fashioned and regressive. And if you take away the stereotypes, you're left with a very, very flimsy diagnosis. So yeah, I'm all for what Book is saying, and I'm all for what you're saying. Let's give a kind of social, kind of psychosocial moratorium to children where they can just be gender non-conforming until they're in a place where that you could actually give a diagnosis that is worth something and it moves away from stereotypes.
And to follow up, that's a great point. I actually hadn't looked at the criteria for gender dysphoria for a long time, and I thought that more recently it's becoming sort of it's being it's not being used anymore to diagnose gender dysphoria because of the automatic. Um, am I wrong about that? But I thought that people were saying instead of diagnosing gender dysphoria, we're just we're just gender affirming. That is what's happening, right?
Right, that's the problem. I mean, that I think is that it's just affirmation. If the kid says I'm trans, you can't really push back on that. Or you can't say, well, hold on here, kiddo. Let's figure
Right.
out, what's so what? You want to wear a dress? That doesn't make you a girl, right? So
Right.
that's what I think is one of the problems. I also think labeling and letting a 10-year-old know they're trans. You don't think they're sucking onto that identity immediately? And I don't even think they know what that means. But now it's become an identity. And this is what I always say to people. It's why I choose to use transsexual as my space, because it is not an identity choice for me. This is an actual medical space where I want it to be a man. I want to look like a man, walk like a man, talk, whatever that means. But it is not my identity choice. I am not a trans identified person. I am a person who has a transsexual diagnosis of gender dysphoria in a medical space, and I believe of this as a disorder. And I get myself into a lot of trouble with this community because I do think I have a mental disorder, and I do push for that space. But do you all see the difference? I think in what's happening here is that kids are immediately being told they're this, they take it on, and then they run with that, and that they might not even be that.
So, like I was saying before, and then Lisa, I want you to jump in, but this also mirrors the other ways in which we're today thinking about mental illness of all kinds, where instead of saying, okay, this person has a particular diagnosis, and therefore that's something for that person to work on, that person embraces that as part of their identity, right? Because there's something about this mental health, mental illness space that has become a way of identifying it, like a way of finding a sense of self, or a group in which to belong. There's a sense of belonging by saying I am bipolar, instead of I have a bipolar disorder to work on, to deal with. It's like the way we went from destigmatizing, instead of destigmatizing so that people could be accepted as they worked on whatever their issues were, we went from destigmatizing to celebrating. That sound about right? Joe, what are the obstacles that practitioners, that mental health and medical practitioners face in trying to do exploratory therapy with gender nonconforming or gender dysphoric kids?
Well, I think this point about diagnosis as identity is a big problem. Our profession has really stopped being about searching for the meaning of certain kinds of behaviors, symptoms. Um, you no longer have that. I mean, it's really shocking what's happened to our profession, where you cannot explore things. So that's the primary obstacle. And then when you have someone come in who's embraced that ideology and has self-identified as having this disorder, it leaves you no room to go deeper with them unless you can disengage on that basis. Like I've had people where I come in and I just say to them, it's not my role to affirm or talk you out of it. My job is to help you make the best decision you can, and that means I have to get to know all about you. So let's start there. And if you can get that kind of buy-in, it then becomes more like, it just becomes therapy, right? It's just what therapy used to be anyway. Um, it's hard to get people to open up to that mindset, though.
Corinna, you're thinking something. I see your wheels turning.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Joe. It's or basically any of the therapists, I suppose, but just follow up from what you said. Is if I'm a teenager and I'm seeing you because I told my parents that I want to be trans, I'm probably a large part of my motive for telling my parents that is, or part of my motive is, I want to fit in with my peer group. So my trans identification is not about me becoming healthy or me becoming less anxious. It's about me becoming more conforming with the people who I hang around. So if you're a therapist, that must be there's nothing you can do about that, right?
Well, I have a client who exactly fits that profile, and we have a good working relationship, and what I've done is I've been able to show her that throughout her childhood, up until we met, she felt like an outsider, for all sorts of reasons, and that I've been able to show her that in her friendships, irrespective of the gender issue, she deforms herself to fit in. She's always sacrificing to give her friends what they need so that they'll accept her. And I don't even have to bring up the gender issue, right? Because we're looking at the dynamics of the situation, right? And how she'll do anything to fit in. And my expectation is that in time we'll get to that point about fitting in by identifying as trans. But you know, if you can just dislodge this fixed idea that everything is about gender, you can do real psychotherapy with these kids, and that's what they need.
Lisa, you had something to say a while back. I want to come back to you.
Yeah, so many interesting points, and I think what Joe was saying about his profession, I would say it's very similar in journalism, which is that instead of investigating, where also people are just wanting to swat away anything that interrupts this dominant paradigm. And so readers of the New York Times or the Washington Post are really not getting the accurate information. And I think, going back to our obsession with identity, I was thinking about, I interviewed 80 people who were very masculine girls, and somewhat like Stella and Buck, they grew up in different times. I mean, Buck and Stella also grew up at different times, but before this dominant paradigm, and they had really different adulthoods. And so they had really similar childhoods, but very different adulthoods. And there was a little bit of room for some of them via the word tomboy. It didn't work for everybody, because some people were like, no, even that is not enough for whatever's going on with me. But it certainly was, it wasn't exactly a label. I mean, it wasn't an identity necessarily, but it provided room and space to explore and to try things out. And I think we might be missing that, this protective bubble of ambiguity for children to try things on. Because I think when a child is trying on a trans identity, it's not just coming with like, I'm getting a haircut. It's coming with like a list of demands that as Karina was saying, like, that come with the peer group, that come with the ideology. It's much more than I'm just kind of like exploring different ways of being in the world. It's asking to have control over how people see you. And I was talking to someone who's an emergency pediatrician about the gender dysphoric kids who were suicidal, who were coming in. And we were talking about medicalization versus social transition. And she said what she hears overwhelmingly from them is, my parents, I want this new name and pronoun, putting the medicalization aside, and my parents won't see me for who I am. My parents won't, they're not seeing me, they're not listening to me. And I said, but how many of them were like that their whole lives, where the parents would be unable to ignore it? I have one of these kids, so I know, like, it emerges by age 3, they're different. And how many of them have no history of gender nonconformity of any kind or gender distress? And are you asking them, why do you think you need this new name? Why do you think you need this new identity? Why do you want your parents, because I think the parents are not resisting necessarily because they're bigots, but they're thinking this isn't the best thing for you, because you don't fit the profile of these other, childhood onset gender dysphoric kids for whom there may be a different protocol. So I think there's, Joe and Karina were talking about how to deal with an individual. We've got this much larger societal issue going on as well, in terms of how we're understanding or not understanding gender nonconformity, because my argument is none of this is helping gender nonconforming children. There's no space for these kids just to be like, this is my body, I'm a female human, I'm ripped, I'm masculine, all my friends are boys, and that's awesome. I don't need to change anything about myself. I don't see that message anywhere.
Right, that message does not seem to exist, that there's this sort of automatic assumption. There's something about the ways in which we've been talking about these categories, these identity categories, whether it's race or gender, whatever the identity categories have become crystallized into stereotypes, and if you don't fit the stereotype in the gender world, then I really have seen for a number of years that kids are, number one, if you're taught that being masculine is toxic, why would you want to be that, right? And if you're taught that being a girl or a woman is about being oppressed, why would you want to be that? So why wouldn't everybody just be non-binary? And I think that actually we're seeing a lot of this movement in that space, in the non-binary. So you don't actually have to medicalize or or choose. You just get to opt out. And then also, I'd love to know what you think the role of pornography is, and all this is like a whole other rabbit hole. But Buck, you have some very different ideas about pornography than I have. But my concern about pornography is if now it's so easy for children to access it, even
Yeah,
accidentally, and so some 9-year-old girl
that's right.
comes across something on Pornhub, and all they can think is like their own little body, and they can't imagine what it would be like to be a grown-up woman, and they can't imagine that what they're looking at could be pleasurable for anybody,
That's
and
right.
what they're looking at probably isn't really in my in my
It's
view.
not.
But
It's not.
but that just looks violent and unpleasant and invasive. And so why would they want, like, I would want that thing sewn up right now, you know? Like, don't put anything in there, you
Yeah,
know?
no, you're right. I'm in a hard place with that. But what I want to say this real quick, and I want to touch on the masculine woman thing. So
Yeah.
when I was growing up, that was really revered. That was, especially in my family. I have two sisters, and we're all butch. My sisters are hard. We were taught to be very, butch on some sense and powerful women, and that was very looked upon as a great thing. And as I got to grow up and I identified as a gay woman and a very butch gay woman, that was also very revered and thought of. And, butches were sought after on some level. So it was really like this awesome thing. And I remember I saw this total change because when I transitioned and I was in the gay woman space, they hated me. They hated me.
Right.
Everyone hated me. I lost every single one of my friends. They called me an actual traitor. So it was insane what happened to me. And I actually transitioned all alone because nobody could even understand that I said I'm a man, not a woman, and people flipped out. But I think my point going to that, saying that it was actually like thought it was cool to stay as a masculine woman, and people didn't want to transition. And now today I could see. I'm not even gonna, but this is so insane. My brain has a hard time. I have so many of those women reaching out to me because they want to transition. The same women who told me that they thought I was sick, I was weird, like it's gross, don't talk to me. They have actually reached out to me to ask me how to transition now. So, I'm like, what? What is that about? Right? Where's that coming from? Why were they not in the same space I was 30 years ago, and now they're doing that now? So that makes me also go, okay, something's going on here. Some kind of influence is going on
That
here.
speaks exactly to what Lisa was saying. It's like something
That's
you're
right.
talking
So
about,
so
this
so the
ideology.
pornography stuff, I'm in a hard place because, as you all know, I create pornography, and that's really how I sort of got into the world. But I did it 20 years ago when none of any of this stuff was happening, and I did it really as an adult, and I make adult entertainment, and that's what people need to understand. And I did the very first ever in the world stuff with trans men, and I did it for body awareness, and I did it so trans men like me didn't have to struggle with not having a penis. And it was very empowering for all of us to see ourselves having sex in this space that was completely different than what you see now. I'm totally against what's happening and how youngsters have really such a, I started in the VHS era and DVD. that so being said, they didn't have access, and kids didn't look at that back in the day. And so I do think it's detrimental, and I do think it has an impact on the young people. As a pornographer, I don't like it, and I do feel upset about how easily accessible it is for these young women, especially, to be seeing stuff that is so it's crazy. So of course it's not healthy. It is not healthy.
And Corinna, you had something you wanted to add.
I did. If I could ask Buck a question, because there's some criticism that some myself and you, I know, receive from the trans or from the women who are in the gender critical community from time to time, which is that by presenting ourselves as being members of the opposite sex, that we create that we have become archetypes for other people to follow. And you have a lot more of a public persona than I do, Buck. But I've that accusation or statement or theory kind of weighs on my mind, and I wonder if it also weighs on yours, that there might be people who are transitioning because they see us as archetypes to follow.
Well, sure. I think about it more today than I ever have, right? And I think to myself, gosh, did I say things that now I hear other kids saying, right? So, I have a lot. I've been doing this forever. So I have so many interviews, and you can see my growth even through interviews. Things I said back 20 years ago, I probably wouldn't say today. But that being said, yeah, on some level, I do think to myself, did I do things that probably weren't great? But I had no, first off, uh, did I know what was going to happen? And if I did know what was going to happen, I probably would have thought twice about what I put out there. I had no idea what was coming in any way, shape, or form. And I'm going to be honest, I don't think what's happening is normal, and I don't think what's happening is actually real trans. I think there's other stuff happening here. So that being said, yeah, I do, but at the same time, no, I am not responsible for other people's space. I'm responsible for my own space. And if people want to take whatever they want to take from me and twist it around and use it because it's Buck's fault, because look what he did, that's just on them, and that's not on me. I very much am pretty straightforward in who I am and what I do and why I sit here today, because I do not believe what is happening is a positive space.
I want to ask you a question about that, Buck, but first I want to have Joe chime in.
Well, I wanted to ask Buck a follow-up question. Of those people who used to be, well, the women who are reaching out to you now about how to transition, what percentage of them are lesbians?
All of them. All of them. Yep. All of them. Butch too. And
Right.
some not so butch. Maybe the middle, it's that thing where you have the good guy and the bad guy on your shoulder whispering in your ear, do it, don't do it. Like part of me is like, I feel very insulted. Like, no, go away. But then I have the other side where I'm like, well, I really did it, and I have a lot of knowledge that how they could do it healthy. So I feel insulted sometimes, but then I'm thinking to myself, but that's what's happening right now. That's what's happening. People are being sucked into some type of space that says your life will be better. You will be better than a butch woman if you transition to become a man. Life is easier. And I don't know where people are getting this idea that life is easy as a trans person. It is not easy, and it's not something I want to be. And I wish I was born a male. But that's what people don't understand. And I think that's the scary part that I see for the kids. The kids just think, oh, my whole life is gonna be amazing. And that is not true. We're gonna medicalize the wrong kids. And then what's gonna happen is something so insane. Mark my words, I think you're all on the same page. We are doing some dangerous stuff right now and not letting therapists do their jobs. I just think it's disgusting how we've blocked therapy. So I'm sorry that you guys can't do your job. I just think it's sickening and gross.
Yeah, I want to hear from Stella about what it's like where you are, Stella. Uh, Joe can speak to what the obstacles are, from the standpoint of laws and ethical standards here. What's it like there, Stella? And turn your camera off when you speak, because it worked really well last time and you're sort of buggy.
Okay. I sound better on off camera. I think it is, the problem is, George Orwell kind of pointed it out many years ago when he said our biggest threat is self-censorship. And I think an awful lot of therapists they don't go near gender. They won't work with children who have gender distress. They're afraid of it. They're afraid to go wrong, and they quickly kind of send them off to gender clinics where they will only receive gender affirmative care. And so, ordinary, competent, experienced, good therapists, as soon as they might be working for 2 years with somebody, and as soon as gender walks in the door, they say, no, 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 I'm not equipped to deal with gender. And they are. And I think there's a real, and as a result, there's a huge amount of people on waiting lists, and there's a huge amount of young adolescents who could be receiving great care who don't. And then there's this weird kind of, I suppose, expectancy from an awful lot of adolescents where they think you have to affirm everything I say because that's in the law. And it's like, well, affirmative, we don't confirm, we affirm. We might affirm that you have very strong emotions and very strong beliefs, but that doesn't mean we agree and confirm everything that you say. We don't actually kind of wrap people up and brand them. And I think people have a misunderstanding of what affirmative care could look like. I think it could look like lots of different things. It could be a gentle kind of beginning of the exploration process rather than this is it and there's nothing else to be offered.
So that makes me think of two questions. The first is, if Erica Anderson were here, what would she says she's gender affirming. She is a gender affirming practitioner. So what would she say that's different? And I don't know if any of you can channel her view. Buck, it sounds like maybe you can from your. So
Yeah,
what would she say?
she's affirming in a sense that she goes through a lengthy space. She doesn't just say like the affirming that I think of when you walk in and the kid says, I'm a giraffe, and you're like, right on, you're a giraffe, cool. So no, she does do the pushback thing, but I think I actually don't want to speak for her, but in my own opinion of being friends with her, is that she affirms if it's for real. She's not going to just affirm you because you say you are, but I think that's pretty much what she's on board with all of us here. I'm pretty sure.
Well, that's what she has told me. She's
Yeah.
told me that the real question is, we're starting in the wrong place with gender affirmation.
That's right.
That was where I started. Like, that was where my question came
Yeah.
from, was like, if we could identify who are the real trans youth, then maybe we wouldn't have this issue. But then we have all these other. So the other thing that I wanted to go back to ask you about, Buck, um, is there was a sense when we were growing up that women were powerful, and that it was that we could be strong, and there was almost a pendulum swing into the more masculine, and like, in order to own our power, we were doing it in a very masculine way. We're being more aggressive or whatever, and then pantsuits, right? Which I love
Me
pantsuits.
too.
But I mean, I'm old enough that there was a time when I was flying on a certain kind of airline ticket where it was required for me to wear a dress or a skirt.
Yeah.
And so if I didn't, and there was one time when I couldn't get on a plane because on my ticket, this particular type of ticket, I had to be wearing a dress. I had to actually go change. I had a dress in my suitcase, and I had to go take it into the bathroom and change into a dress. So coming from that to empowering women to be however they want to be, whether it's on the very masculine presentation, whether we present in a very masculine way or we present in a very feminine way, whatever it is, the fact that we can own it and claim it is empowering, right? There was a sense of empowerment. But the whole cultural shift right now seems to be a shift to disempowerment, and that being disempowered has some status, that there is some kind of reverse prestige, so that people, it's sort of the thing where we don't kids don't seem to revere or admire other kids who overcome.
Mm.
right? They admire and revere the kids who have a lot of grievances, who can claim a lot of oppression. Um, and I think that this is related in that there's, that's where we get these identities. We're identifying in a way that allows us to be in an oppressed group. Because if we're not in an oppressed group, then we're oppressors,
But who are these kids? This is a certain type of kid because I have a kid. I have a 9-year-old kid, a 9-year-old boy. He's a 9-year-old boy, and that's, you know what I mean. He's playing with all the other. I've never heard any of this stuff ever. Any of what we're talking about here. So right, these are certain groups of kids. Where are they coming from? What kind of kids are they? Because I don't think clearly not all kids, but these are on some level damaged kids already, and they're seeking something, right? Because I consider myself on some level that kind of a kid. I was seeking a lot when I was younger, and I was a punk rocker. I was always doing the things outside of the norm of things, right? Because that's how, and my masculinity was very important to me. And what you say is right. We're taking that away from this power space for women, and I also think we're doing it with men. We're also degrading men and telling them they can't be masculine, or masculinity is toxic, or all white men are evil now. And like the stuff that's being put out there is so, I don't even know what you label it, but it's controlling.
right.
We're being
Well,
controlled on
and
some
that,
level.
and so I want to say like two tiny other things, and then have Lisa chime in. But
Yeah.
what this seems to go along with, to me, and tell me if you see this, is the the uh, the idea that okay, I've lost my train of thought. I'm
Okay,
going to
come
let
back.
Lisa go, and then there was two things here that I'm going to come back to
Okay, yeah.
when my train gets back on.
Well, I just wanted to add to, I'm trying to, for my own sanity and for my work, sort of trace how this happened, and trace this zeitgeist shift, because it interests me, um, and because I don't think or talk about any other subject than this. So I think that I think part of what's happened is part of the zeitgeist shift is not just the, oh, what did you call it? The reverse. You said Panama had some great phrase, which I've already forgotten, but the embrace of victimization. It's related to the kind of inclusion dialogue, and the kind of, instead of teaching children to navigate obstacles, we clear the obstacles away. That has been a parenting shift, which Stella can also, I know Stella knows a lot about that, and has the actual correct terminology for whatever that is. That's part of what has happened. And that's happened in conjunction with, uh, um, this hypergendering of childhood. So Buck talked about, like, masculine girls were cool. When I was a kid in the 70s, masculine girls were cool. I wrote a whole book about masculine girls. And then there was a generational reaction to that, which was girl power, right? And then there was a generational reaction to that, which is what we're in now. So we really had, like, we went from unisex clothes, and everybody had a bowl haircut, boy or girl, and to every single part of childhood will be hypergendered, and will sell twice as much, and we'll have prenatal sex testing, and we'll have gender reveal parties. I think part of what's happening right now is the generational reaction to that is exploding the binary on some level, because it's been so imposed onto children at the same time that we're raising them to be fragile, which really frightens me, because I don't feel particularly equipped to navigate the world, and somehow I have found myself to the world's most controversial subject, unwittingly. Here I am. I've learned all this information. I cannot rest until everyone else in my kind of cohort, of liberals knows what I know. So all I do is try to get the information out. But I'm like, the kids are being taught to be fragile, and there's hypergendering. There's a lot of different stuff going on. There's a lot of confusion, and going back to that original, whoever brought it up, protect trans kids, and then we've got to come back to like, well, how do we do that? What is that? Is that clearing all the obstacles so they're completely unable to navigate the world? What happened to, you know, the most ancient wisdom in the world of life is suffering? I'm not saying like I want children to suffer. I'm saying that we want to build resilient children and who understand that gender, and when I use that word, I mean the expectations we attach to sex doesn't have to limit them.
So Lisa, you
Yeah.
reminded me of these things, and I think you'll have something to say, and then I want to make sure that our participant and parent can get into this conversation also. But the two things that you reminded me were the things that I wanted to address were that there are age appropriate struggles between children and parents, and this thing in teen years of, you know, you don't see me for who I am is normal. That is the parent child struggle in adolescence, and we're now pathologizing that and normalizing a pathology, and like everything is upside down, right? This is sort of what the ideology does, right? So that yes, maybe family therapy is going to be helpful. Maybe there's a dynamic in the family that needs to be addressed, or maybe it's just normal individuation, and the kids are struggling with that. But also there's a new kind of expectation that parents have that they're supposed to be their kids' friends instead of being a parent and not a friend. And so I think parents have a hard time being just a parent and not a friend. And Joe, you're going to be able to speak to this, and Stella, you can say if this is an issue that you see too. And I think kids struggle with, you know, if their parent is not acting like their friend, then they think there's something wrong there too. So that's on the one side. And then relatedly, we're seeing this phenomenon where young people feel entitled to make demands. They don't make requests, they make demands. And this affirmation kind of theory, it feeds this young people making demands kind of relationship with adults, relationship with authority figures. And that's also, I can imagine it being a result of some of this ideology, because the ideology really does have to do with equalizing hierarchies. So you have a hierarchy, an authority figure who is making some kind of creating a boundary, and then you have children making demands to take that boundary away. And we see this when kids arrive on college campuses and then school their professors, you know. So anyway, it seems to me like it's all of a piece. Like the gender stuff that we're seeing reflects all of the other things that we're seeing in this ideology. Lisa, I'm sure, has a lot more to say, but Stella and Joe, you both have things to say about this. Stella, why don't you start, and then Joe.
Okay. Yeah, it is all of a piece. I wrote a book called Cottonwool Kids in 2015, and so many of those Cottonwool kids are the archetypal gender kids, insofar as we moved from child-centered to child-led, and we've kind of lost an awful lot of authority as parents, but we've also got more responsibility as parents, and we've professionalized so much of childhood that children now kind of they expect an awful lot from the adults, whether it's their parents. They want their parents to be psychologists, entertainers, teachers, everything, and it's too much. We're asking too much of parents, and it's creating a very kind of a fragile, frankly, and a very expectant children. And on top of that, I wrote another book called Fragile, where it's all linked. It's very much a part of the mental health messages that were nuanced and complex, and trying to kind of really establish good mental health policies all around the world, got reduced into sound bites that frankly botched a lot of kind of what would be good mental health thought and turned it into little slogans and phrases that people have ran with. And so we've ended up with concepts like gender affirming care is apparently therapy when it's not therapy. It's a process where you just nod along to things. So it's like there's been a massive shift in our psyche. It's kind of become a perfect storm, and it seems to manifest with gender kind of distressed kids. But frankly, it's something that's going on in society. There's a diagnostic creep. There's a real issue with kind of dumbed down mental health. We're looking for therapeutic support rather than therapeutic process. There's so many issues that have kind of emerged. No wonder we're all obsessed with gender, because gender kind of picks up on all of them.
That's a good point, about people looking for therapeutic support. That didn't used to be a phrase, years ago. Therapy was supposed to be challenging. It wasn't supposed to be for
It's supposed to be, yeah, you're supposed to like therapeutic change, and it's a process. So you go through a process with your therapist. It was a big kind of event rather than I'm just looking for support and your job is to support. That's a completely different
Can I
concept,
touch
and
on
it
that?
slipped in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Buck, go ahead,
Yeah,
please. And
yeah,
then,
Stella, that's so right on. When I went to therapy, my therapist was a gay woman who had just started her practice. Had no, I transitioned 30 years ago, so as you know, there was no literature, if any, and it was mostly for male to female. So my gay female therapist was very loving and very caring, but she did not just sit there and go, "Oh," she pushed back on me. She did. She was like, "Well, what makes you think you're a boy? What makes you think that you feel like a man? What does that mean to feel like a man? What are your feelings?" She goes like, what are your feelings?" And I go, "My feelings are fucked." And she's like, "Those aren't feelings." I'll never forget that. But she did push back on me. She was not like, "Okay, Buck, yep, let's figure this." She really did make me sit there for over a year, of just until we started to touch on how can we do this. She's like, "I don't know what to do. I don't, and there was no internet." Remember that? So I couldn't just Google sex change. So that I just want to touch on that. My therapist was a therapist, and here I stand today in my transition, powerful as ever, and never looked back. So this is why I really want people to hear what I'm saying. It's not that I don't think kids have some form of dysphoria. They do, and some kids might need to transition. But I don't think what we're doing is a service to these kids. I think we're doing a disservice.
yeah, Joe. Oh,
Well,
Corinne.
yeah, on that point, I want to say that I agreed with what Stella was saying. It's like an abdication of parenting. It's like, when in the history of child rearing did we assume that people who have no experience of life know better than the grown-ups? I mean, when did that happen? And I think that parents today are often afraid of their children. The parents of the young woman I was describing earlier, I had to tell them that they needed to be more parental, that their child was floundering and needed the grown-ups to come in and set limits for her. And that was like they had just given her like absolute freedom to lead her life the way she wanted, and she didn't have the self-discipline to do it. So the parent's job was to come in and provide that for her. That seems to be kind of like an alien concept these days.
Yeah, Corinna, what were you going to add to this?
I'm sorry. It was more related to what Buck had said before Joe. So I'm sorry I'm not responding to Joe, but Buck, you ended your last paragraph by saying that you believe that there are some kids who need to transition. And this is interesting to me because I'm at the point where I would say that that should be asymptotic to zero. That should be the last option, and even if it's the last option, it should be something that is put off until a child has had a chance to get deeper into puberty and try to mature their bodies and understand how their bodies work. So I want to be very specific when I hear you say there are some kids who need to transition. I don't know that we have any diagnostic criteria that would help us know that there are kids who need to transition.
So right, I'm 100% in agreement with you. What I mean by that is I think there are kids like me, and what I mean by transition is in an adult space. I don't believe that when I say kids need to transition, I mean go through a therapy space, and I do not mean medication. I'm 100% against all puberty blockers, all of that, and I believe in social transition. I do believe in that because of my own experience and how that did help me. But I think I misspoke then because I agree with you. I do not think, I think we need to do as much therapy as possible to make sure that they're making this right choice and not just, that's why I hate the trans kid thing because you immediately stuck them at, so I do think we're in agreement on that, but I do think eventually if a child grows up and can make those choices, then they, you know, they could be, I do believe there are kids that have dysphoria and would need to transition at an age when they can make those choices.
So
Does that make
I
sense?
want to, before I go to Lisa, I just want to play devil's advocate on two sides of that, right? So the first side of that is to say the it may be the case for female to male that not that going through a feminizing puberty may not have any sort of negative effects on transitioning. I mean, you wouldn't be as masculine physically as you would be if you hadn't, but it, you know, you went through a completely, you know, natural puberty and you are as masculine a man as I've ever seen, right? um, and yet it can be harder for a boy who becomes a 6'5", very big, low voice. Um, you know, if the boy goes through a natural puberty, it can then be much harder for that adult man to transition comfortably into a more feminized body, you know? And so I'm playing devil's advocate on that side, that maybe there are kids for whom a puberty blocker to cross-sex hormones transition is going to be the much better road for them.
I agree. There might be a very small amount of those, but
Yes,
we're lumping all the kids into that space.
correct.
The
Yeah,
other thing is that I know lots of trans women who went through puberty and had all the masculine and are living a beautiful, amazing life today. So I can tell you from my own experience with trans women who went through puberty, they seem to be perfectly fine. Yeah, it might have been easier. They didn't have huge shoulders and you know what I mean, like 6 feet tall.
right.
But at the same time, they made the best of it. But are we over medicalizing? Are we over medicalizing, and are more kids going to get hurt? That's what I'm looking at. The
Okay,
bigger
great. So now I'm gonna play
right.
devil's advocate on the opposite side, and to say, but maybe social transition, maybe even socially transitioning, as Lisa brought up at the very beginning of this call, maybe even socially transitioning is pushing in a direction that, and Lisa can speak more to this. You know, maybe that pushes in a direction that puts them on a path that it's very hard to get off of. Lisa, you wanted to say something, so why don't you jump in
Well,
here?
initially I was curious about that with Buck, and I don't remember with Stella exactly if she was. Stella, were you living as a boy or you were just looking like a boy? What was
I
happening?
looking like a boy.
Looking
Um,
like a boy, but understanding everyone knew you were a female.
Everybody who was close to me knew I was a female, but I was asked very, very often, "Are you a boy or a girl?" And I'd answer various different, usually a boy, but I'd answer different phrases. I sometimes said no. I think I was non-binary in 1980. Um, yeah, so I hadn't got as far as pronouns. It's interesting that Buck said he changed pronouns. I hadn't. No.
I mean, I was listening to Buck and thinking like, yes, that brought Buck psychological relief and allowed him to like be himself in a world where there wasn't exactly a category for him. But as we can see from the study that came out today, that socially transitioning is much more likely to end in a child medicalizing. So I think it's an important question to be asking. And in some ways, I feel that the person who has all the answers in a lot of ways is Paul Vasey, who Stella did 2 interviews with, and who I've talked to a lot over the last kind of year and a half as I've had my whatever happened to me, where I felt I was finally able to speak up after spending almost 4 years reporting on this in a kind of agnostic way, trying to stay employed and trying to protect my child, etc. And now feel I can no longer do that, and that I'm not doing my job as a journalist anymore when I cover up. And what I learned over the last year and a half from Paul is that in cultures where they have categories for Buck, and maybe for Stella, because I mean Stella ended up different than Buck, but that there's almost no gender dysphoria, and there's plenty of homophobia in those cultures. And in fact, when a straight man sleeps with a fa'afafine in Samoa, you know, they're not thought of as, they're not deviating, but you wouldn't have two masculine straight men in a relationship there. But there's some kind of category that does all this work, and then we have a name for it. It's unremarkable, and it's just understood. That's that kind of person. And when we're talking about we need to transition kids early so that they can actually pass, I still think we're not doing, kind of keep going back to none of this helps us accept gender nonconformity. So if we had room and space in our culture for these trans women who were 6 feet tall and, you know, with broad shoulders, and that was fine, and we weren't trying to say you're the same as women, you know, and then maybe we wouldn't be having these battles. Maybe we wouldn't have dysphoria if we had these kids and they emerged incredibly masculine girls and incredibly feminine boys, and we just were like, oh, that's probably one of those, we'll find out. And then nothing else had to change. You didn't need to change their identities, which is a huge, I mean, just 1 second digression. You know, my identity has changed in the last year and a half because I can't really be a Democrat anymore because of the way our party and the left media is handling this issue. I find that so disconcerting. My having an identity change is like, you know, the floor shifting beneath my feet. So it's really a huge thing. Whereas if we just kind of had one of those, we'll see what happens, maybe we wouldn't have gender dysphoria,
I
which
want to bring
a lot of
Carol
people would
into
be out not making money, of course. And
yeah, and I want to bring Carol into the conversation.
Hi, this has been great to listen to. And I just wanted to, Pamela, try to throw some thoughts out about the question that you asked about identifying kids who might really benefit from transition to kind of make life easier potentially for, in particular, trans women. So as far as, Lisa, the categories that exist in some other cultures, like for Fa'afafine, my understanding, and Stella, you or anyone else can correct me if I'm wrong, but those are categories typically for effeminate gay men that make that kind of gender nonconformity just standard. That's just a way, that's just like a sexual orientation or something, or not a sexual orientation, but just kind of a group of people who are different and accepted socially. I don't believe there are categories for trans men typically. And I think one reason might be is because male gender nonconformity is so much more punished socially than is female gender nonconformity. And then just, I think that point about like the Fa'afafine and a third category is relevant to trying to figure out which kids might benefit most from transition. You know, this is controversial, but there are the gay gender nonconforming kids, and there are those who are going to grow up to be autogynephiles, and you know, which I think that, like, my view would be little boys who are going to grow up to be gay, who are very gender nonconforming and being bullied for that, et cetera. Those are the kids who are really almost all of them are likely, if they're not socially or transitioned in any other way, to grow into gay men and like be able to use their penis and have a blast. And I think I'll just say AGP category is a little bit of a more difficult situation, because I think those boys, when they grow into men, are not likely to grow out of that, if you want to call it a sexual orientation. So I'm just throwing that out there in terms of ways to think about who we can. Yeah, and I don't believe, personally, I don't see any evidence for like trans. I see kids who are super dysphoric and might really benefit from transitioning, and that's the right thing for them to do. Uh, so I vote for dispensing with the idea that some kids are trans and we have to identify them. That's as though there's like a little organ in the brain that if only we could get the science right, we would get. There's like 10 million, or I don't know how many different, not 10 million, but paths to be gender dysphoric. So this idea that we can identify trans kids, I think, is completely wrong. We have to understand how complex the etiology is, and that each kid is going to be a little bit different and need different kind of therapy. And I'm just, yeah, I want to throw that out. And I'm so sorry I have to do my final exam. I just have to write it.
I'm glad that you've been able to listen with one ear.
And I think Paul also notes that autogynephilia is not really found in those other cultures. That so far seems to be a Western phenomenon. And then those kids, they don't usually emerge until around puberty or after, or much later. Anyway, it's harder to identify, I think, an autogynephile. Is that right? In early childhood, because they're not the kind of what they, the Blanchard homosexual subtype. It's a very, those kids emerge that way at 3-4 years old. You can identify them very easily. I'm not sure that you can identify some autogynephiles. They're not feminine, right? So it's not obvious, most of them.
Well, like some would be and some wouldn't be, right, Carol? And some would have a sexual orientation that's heterosexual, and some would have a homosexual orientation while they're men, right?
So Bailey talks about the early signs of AGP, and that there are a bunch of kids who will grow up to have that, I'll just call it a sexual orientation, who may be masculine, but since it's if you think of it as a sexual orientation, most sexual orientations express themselves very, very early. If you're heterosexual, you pretty much know you're attracted to the opposite sex. My kid knew it in like kindergarten. And if you're homosexual, you might not know, say, that you're attracted to the opposite sex, to the same sex, but you have patterns of behavior, say, that are consistent with the sexual orientation that you are going to express as an adult. So the idea is that if AGP is really a distinct sexual orientation, that there should be signs that we can discern fairly early, one of which is that those kids like to dress up in their sister's clothes. And even though they may be masculine, that's something they like to do. And then people get confused, like, are you gay, or are you going to grow up to be gay, or should we just discipline you? But if you think of that as a sexual orientation, I personally think that would be a huge benefit to that population, and that we're thinking of it as so stigmatizing. But in my view, this would be an enormous help, and it should be destigmatized.
And Carol, so for anybody who is either on this call or who watches this YouTube, on YouTube later, those who are autogynephilic, do they benefit from transitioning or not?
It depends. So some people can live with it and find acceptance. This is my understanding. I'm not an expert in this area. This is from other people's research. Some men do try to live with it, but over time it can become increasingly difficult, and transition seems to be the only thing that can relieve the dysphoria associated with it. So I would say, out of all the groups, that seems like one that transition should be more supported, I would say, than others. But again, this is not my area of expertise.
And I was talking to somebody who is finishing a degree in psychology now, and he said that autogynephilia is not covered at all anymore.
Well, that's what I was just going to add, with going back to the suppression of the desistance literature, that there's a lot of suppression of literature about autogynephilia as well, and a lot of pressure to reject that it exists. And the politicization of the research is a huge problem in this issue. So I was watching, there's a young man who's been making, autogynephilia videos on YouTube, and he got a hold of it. He understands that about himself. He's educating other people. And, it's a spectrum, right? So it starts with, transvesticism, and it goes all the way to, I need to radically change my body. But I think the idea is that if you're being taught that that's about gender identity, and you've been told, as Debbie Hayton talked about on Stella's podcast, that, or maybe she said it to me. I interviewed her also for the project I'm working on, so maybe she said it to me, but that they were all, she was on these chat rooms, these trans women chat rooms, and they're all denying the existence of AGP. So it took her years. It took her years to figure out that applied to her. She's very happy that she changed her body. That was the right thing for her. But it doesn't have to be based on this idea of gender identity. It can be, an understanding of your sexual orientation. So I think the suppression of research and the politicization of research is really a huge problem. And again, I go back to, I'm just trying to make sure all these people in my cohort, all these liberal parents, have all the information. And when their son, it's and the thing about, yes, they're getting an erotic charge from trying on their sister's stockings at age 7, but we might not know that, right? They might be hiding that for their whole lives, which is why some of them didn't come out until middle age, when they couldn't, often when their wives had babies, or something made it come out, and then they couldn't suppress it anymore.
So I want to just note that I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We can go longer for anybody who can stay, but I know Corinna needs to go. I think, maybe just another 10 minutes for anybody who can stay, so that everybody can sort of say whatever the final thing is that they want to say to wrap up. And also so that our parent and our other participant here, Chris, can ask a question or say something, but let's just be respectful of time. And Corinna, I'm sorry that you have to go. Thank you so much, Corinna.
Pamela, thank you for hosting this. This is great. Take care, everybody.
Do this again. I think we should have more of these conversations. It's important. I don't think that there's enough of this sort of getting out into, spaces where people aren't already having these conversations. Thanks again, Corinna.
Bye, Corinna.
So, so I just want to ask our parent or Chris if you want to chime in at all before I have everybody, sort of close whatever it is that they want to close with.
Yeah, sure. So this has been really amazing. As a parent of she's now 18. I appreciate the insight that everybody has provided. And all I can tell you is I am also a liberal. I am politically homeless. And I can tell you that what I saw happen in our house was most definitely caused by a group of friends who all, I believe, felt uncomfortable in their bodies. And so they all adopted this persona. I had 6 months of horrible therapy for her. It was all affirming. It made her much, much worse until I found a psychologist who specializes in body dysmorphia. So she's been in therapy for 2 years now. And they're going to move on to EMDR because we adopted her and she's had pre-adoption trauma, and she now has been diagnosed with complex trauma. So I'm just very appreciative of the professionals that we've had who are willing to work with her and work with us. And we are also much older parents. So we never thought that we'd have to be friends to our kids. We want to be parents and we like setting boundaries. Maybe we set too many, I don't know. But in any event, she's 18. We've lost a lot of power. She's going to be going off to college. So we are crossing our fingers and saying our prayers that we can get her through this And I believe that we will be able to. I just don't know how many more years we're going to have to go through this. We're in our third year now. So, but thank you, everybody. I really appreciate all of your insight. It's been, I've taken copious notes, and it's been very helpful. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Chris, did you want to? You need to unmute yourself.
God, we've been doing this years and I'm still unmuting myself. Thank you so much for convening this, and just thanks to the panelists and the participants for the generosity, contributing what they have, and it's been great to learn more about it, and thank you.
Thanks. I want to ask Stella, you said something, and hopefully this is a good thing for you to, to say to close, but you were saying that therapists are afraid to work with gender issues, and they send the kids off to gender clinics. What is it that they're afraid of? Are they afraid of liability? Are they afraid that they're going to contravene an ethical standard or a law? What is the fear?
Yeah, they're afraid that they might inadvertently practice conversion therapy, even though really conversion therapy is really from a bygone year when it was for practice on gay people, and it was a vicious and terrible practice. And it's not therapy, it's a kind of religious zealotry more than anything. But they're often afraid that by exploring the person's psyche, that they might inadvertently be accused of conversion therapy, because it's very badly defined. Nobody's really very sure what it is and what it isn't. And their gender distress is a new concept that very few people are trained in, and so they feel out of their depth. It's a new concept, and there's an awful lot of scare stories, and as a result, I think really distressed and vulnerable adolescents are missing out on good quality therapy.
Thank you. Joe, I'm going to go to you and ask, what are the barriers, the legal and ethical barriers to practicing the kind of therapy that's necessary for these kids?
Well, Stella and I both know a therapist in a different state who has taken a fairly public stance opposing affirmative care. And the trans rights activists have come after her and are lodging claims against her with her board. Her license is being challenged. I mean, it's a dangerous environment to be practicing in, because there are activists out there who will come after you. It's just the way it is. I'm it's risky for me even to be taking part in this discussion, because somebody could come after me.
Yeah. Lisa, why don't I go to you next?
About conversion therapy, or
just like what, we're going to wrap up this, what's the sort of, is there anything that you didn't say that you wanted to say in a brief way that we can, close with?
No, I think it's been wonderful to be here with people who I only know from Twitter, like Buck and Corinna and Carol, who's I've been following them for a long time. So it makes me happy to be among you all discussing this. And one of my first assignments as a writer was to review a movie called, I think it was called Schwarzwald. Is that your movie, Buck? Are you in that? Which I'm still recovering from, by the way. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm hoping I haven't permanently tanked my career by speaking out of this. I hope this is the dip, and it comes back around, and I can pay for groceries. But I feel like the important thing is to create an environment where we can discuss and debate this, and we don't know what's best to do. I mean, and when people say it's simple and clear what we're supposed to do, I just stay away from those people. And I think that people like Stella, who I admire so much, and who are, when we're talking about being concerned about childhood transition, but we fully accept and embrace trans people, that message gets really lost. And it's very important to separate that we are talking about children with gender dysphoria, and we try to move people to use that phrase. And we try to move the media to use that phrase. And then we ask ourselves, what's the best treatment for that? You know, and we make sure that everyone has access to the same store of knowledge that all of us here have, because most people don't have it. They don't know about autogynephilia, they don't know about the desistance literature, etc. So I mean, that's my hope for this could be a great year, a difficult year, but a great year when a lot of information gets out there.
Yeah. Yeah. Buck, I'm going to go to you, and then I'll have Carol at the end.
First off, thanks so much for having me. It's been amazing and just so I think it's so powerful when people get together like this and really just put this out there, because now anyone can find this information. So thank you for letting my voice be a part of this. And I also want to thank the parent for being on here, because it is difficult. I mean, I'm such a crybaby. I always cry because I feel so lucky to be alive, and I feel so lucky to live my life the way I live it. And I feel so lucky that I get to speak on things that are so important to me, which are kids, because I didn't suffer as a kid. I did suffer in my later years, but I have to say that it is so important that people see that not all kids are the same. And so to the parent there, you're so awesome. You're so loving. You're so beautiful. I know you're struggling with your kid, but you remind me of my parents. And, my parents struggled in the 60s and 70s, and nobody could help them. And, it stays with me. It stays with me now as a parent, and thinking of my parents and what they went through, and they didn't have any of this, but they're so amazing because they just saw me as this kid and they let me be Buck. And it was the reason, I really believe it's the reason I am this person today, because my parents loved me and saw me as who I wanted to be seen as. But that being said, these are the things that are going to save kids. So I just want to thank all of you for just caring about trans people, because you do. You wouldn't be saying the things you are saying if you didn't care about us. And that's what people need to see. It's not that people don't care about these kids. We do care about these kids, but we need to understand that this is so huge and so vast that we cannot shove kids in one single space. We are hurting them. We are hurting them before we're helping them. So and this is coming from an actual transsexual person who had saved my life. I believe that we are hurting kids and we are not helping them when we have only affirmative health care or therapy, and we're just immediately putting them on this space to medication. That is a very dangerous space to go on when a kid, why would we want to medicalize kids so fast? So anyway, I'm just being an emotional weirdo right now, but I just want to say thank you everyone for always hearing me and giving me space here. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you so much, Buck. All right, Carol, you are
Buck, thank you for expressing yourself in this way. First of all, because it's really nice to hear it. Second of all, it makes me feel comfortable for crying on every single Zoom call and podcast. So I share that with you, and I appreciate that. And I just want to pick up on what you said, because I think what I'm hearing from everybody, and this does make me emotional too, is that what you're talking about is acceptance for kids just being who they are. And it's not accepting them as trans. Of course, if they transition, then yes, you want to accept them as having transitioned. And if they're comfortable in that, then you want to accept that. It's accepting them for who they are in terms of their behavior, if it's not hurting anybody. And that's generally what gender expression is. If you're a boy and you want to play with dolls, go for it. Nobody should ever stigmatize that. So I think that's thing one. And thing two is, Pamela, thank you for bringing everybody together. And I am sorry that this requires bravery. Lisa, you joked about ruining your career, but just bringing up autogynephilia, I'm saying that word, that is something that, yeah, I don't want to give anybody any ideas, but they're going to do what they're going to do. But these are things that need to be discussed. And we need to, again, destigmatize people's orientations and behaviors and normalize this stuff so that we can help people who need to make changes. And that's all I want to say.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you. I hope that we can have more of these conversations, and especially as more, research comes out. Lisa, thank you for bringing up that study just came out today. I'm going to look for it. And, I'm going to, at the end of this video, I'll put a bunch of links to resources. So please send me whatever you think I should add to the end of this video, so that parents and educators and other people who care about this have resources, like Lisa, like your Substack, and Joe, your website, and Stella, your website, and Carol, your website. Buck, I'm not putting people towards your porn, but but other things.
He's got merch for sale. You
Yeah, that's right. There's no porn on my website.
But I mean, this is not a specific issue that I have a particular personal kind of experience with, but I think that it's part, as Carol was saying, the issue is really about acceptance. And in my view, what has happened in the last few years with a kind of ideology that's crept into education and, in our cultural institutions, is it's an ideology that talks about inclusion, but it's really about exclusion, and it's about not accepting people for who they are. It's about only accepting people for what they are, and and it's about a kind of objectification, and seeing people as tools, instead of seeing people as friends and objects of love. And so I hope that with more of these conversations, we can break the hold that this has on people, and sort of invigorate the idea of having affection for other people, instead of just seeing them as allies, or people who will be useful in some way, but really see people for who they are, and love them. So thank you all very, very much for this conversation, and let's keep in touch, and I hope we have more of these opportunities.
Thank you, Pamela. It was great.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, everybody. It was fabulous.
everybody.
Thank
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
You too.